Good evening, everyone. Tonight, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be looking at the dialogue between Abraham and God before the destruction of Sodom, and we're going to compare that with certain Hittite king prayers, and also a Hittite kind of a priest instruction. I'm going to tell you the dates and the background of the Hittite prayers when we get to them. I'm not going to introduce them now, but I'm going to give you an introduction once we discuss those. But I'm going to start with, let's take a look at the biblical text first, and then we're going to look at the Hittite text and what it kind of tells us about ancient Near Eastern views of things like collective punishment. And again, there isn't a one clear-cut view, but we'll see how it plays out. So let's start with the account in Breshit, with the account in Genesis. So I am reading now from Breshit Yud Chet Tet Zayin. So that's Genesis 18:16. Okay, so this is the Avram and Sarah have gotten the news about their son, and now, of course, the angels, the people, are turning their heads and they're looking towards Sodom. Vayikumu misham ha'anashim, and the people got up from there. Vayashkifu al pnei Sodom, and they looked towards Sodom. Va'avram olech imam l'shalcham, and Avram goes with them to send them away, to send them off. He's being a good host and releasing them as hosts do. Vashem amar, hamachasa ani me'Avraham asher ani oseh. And God said, am I going to conceal from Abraham what I'm going to do? V'Avram hayo yeh l'goy gadol v'atzum. Avram is going to be a great nation, and all the nations are going to be blessed. All the nations of the land are going to be blessed through him. Okay. Ki yidativ leman asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito acharav v'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat leman havi Hashem al Avraham et asher diber alav. Okay, so what does God say? I have recognized him. I have made him known. I've acknowledged him, okay, so that he should command his children and his household after him, and they will keep the way of God, or the way of the Lord, right? To do justice, to do righteousness and justice. Tzedakah here is actually closer to justice, right? But righteousness and justice, so that God will bring on Abraham everything that he essentially promised to him. Okay, so what's going on? God's going to share what his plans are. Why? Because Abraham needs to understand the correct way to apply justice, right? In other words, we're already bringing in the topic of justice. This isn't Abraham bringing it in. This is the divine bringing it in, right? That I am going to tell Abraham what I'm doing because he has a special role among the nations. And now, and so he has to understand the way of justice and righteousness, really of justice. And then, Vayomer Hashem, Zakat Sodom v'Amorah ki rabah, v'chatatam ki chavda me'od. And God said, the cry of Sodom and Amorah is great, and their sin, because it is very heavy. So God can hear the cries from the tremendous sin of Sodom. Okay. I will go down now and see. Have they really done completely this shout that's coming to me? And if not, I shall know. Okay. So what's going on here? And I've mentioned this before. We've seen it in other places. Before God, there's this idea that before you apply a collective punishment, you have to investigate. You must investigate, okay? So God is going to go down and investigate. Is it really like what I'm hearing? Is this really the case, right? because you must investigate whenever there's a collective punishment. Okay, we see that with what we call the Irani Dachat, the city that's totally destroyed because they're idol worshippers, right? So in Dvarim Yud Gimel to Yud Tet, that's Deuteronomy 13:13-19. So in that, you must go and really check it well, right? The idea is that you must investigate before doing any kind of collective punishment. Where do people not investigate with horrible consequences? Anyone know? One of my favorite stories, even though it's a horrible story, Pilagish Bakiba, the concubine of Gibeah. There, they listen.
Favorite story?
It's not okay. It's hard to say. It's not my favorite. It's just a lot in it. There's a lot that's going on in that story, and the more you delve in, kind of the more you see how much of it's supposed to be a Twilight Zone. You're supposed to be like, oh no, it's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's almost like this kind of horror that you're supposed to realize, and that so frequently when people study it, they don't get that you're supposed to be feeling the horror that you're feeling. That you're supposed to be seeing that everyone thinks they're doing the right thing when they keep on sinking further and further into horrible consequences, where it begins with a rape and frankly it ends with a rape. And you're supposed to see that. You're supposed to see that their solution is this rape of, this kidnapping of all these girls at the end. And you're supposed to realize that this is horrible. And part of what starts it all off is that people get outraged and react without investigating, even though we know that something horrible did occur. But you can't do this kind of collective punishment without investigating. Even God investigates. Here we have a case where God is going down to investigate, as one does, right? So he goes down to investigate, but he already said he's going to share it with Abraham, right? Vayifnu misham. Now we go back to the angels. Vayifnu misham ha'anashim, and the people turned from there. Vayachu Sodom, and they went to Sodom. V'Avraham odenu omed lifnei Hashem, and Abraham's still standing before God. Vayigash Abraham v'yomar. So Abraham apparently kind of, God shared. We don't get what he shared with Abraham. It's not clear when God was speaking to himself, quote unquote, was he also sharing this with Abraham? Possibly, because before that he said, why would I hide this from Abraham? I'm going to share with him what I'm doing. So it's very possible that, and especially since this is the way justice is done, he could say, I'm going to go down now and investigate. Is what's going on in Sodom really what I hear? And he shared that with Abraham, right? And then the people / malachim, angels / go off to Sodom. Avram's still standing there, and now Avram has his chance to kind of argue with God and get him to relent. Okay. Vayigash Avraham v'yomer, and Avram approached and said, the word vayigash, it's very possible that it actually means something formal. It's like a lawyer approaching the bench kind of thing. It's very possible that it's more than just coming, that now he's actually presenting an argument. Moshe Matitya says that in the Migdal Bavel story, God does not investigate. On the contrary, he does investigate. He goes down to see the tower. Aha! In the Tower of Babel story, God goes down to see the tower before he does anything. Yes, he investigates. Nice try. Okay.
Yeah. No, Rashi says that that's exactly what God does. Yeah.
Rashi says it's what God does, but regardless, without Rashi, God goes down to see the tower before he does anything. Okay. So yeah, he investigates. He sees what they're doing. Okay. That's the Tower of Babel story. But
can I just for a second take issue with that?
Go ahead. All right, go ahead. Go for it.
God says explicitly, he says, all right, you know what? Whatever. It would take too long to explain it. Maybe I'll talk to you about it later.
I've already said, regardless of the fact that God goes to see the tower, it is different language in the Tower of Babel story. I agree. In other words, there it's like, oh, God's like kind of, it almost sounds like he's sightseeing. So he went down to see this tower, right? And he goes down to see the tower and he's like, wow, if they do this, then, what can't they do? I argue that the Tower of Babel story is more about consequences than punishment. In other words, God wants it to spread out. God doesn't want them to stay all together and have a tower and be hubristic. And so what happens is, so that they should not continue doing this, their languages get mixed up and they have to scatter, right? As opposed to a real punishment. No one dies, right? No one really suffers. They just stop. God just stops them from building the tower because he's God, right? So he does the easiest thing to kind of make them stop building, which is mix up the languages. And of course, then we understand why we have multiple languages, etc. Okay, but yes, I do agree that in the Tower of Babel story, he goes down, but it doesn't say he's going down to investigate. He's going down just to kind of see the tower. And I do think that also what happens is less a punishment and more just a consequence and God making a move to stop him from doing something he doesn't want. Okay, back to our story. All right. So now Avram's going to go to God. He's kind of formally approaching the bench, as it were, and he's going to argue with God about what's happening. Okay. Right? Are you going to cause the death of an innocent person with a wicked person? You can translate it righteous with wicked. You can also translate it a person who's an innocent person. A tzaddik is also someone who's innocent in law. So it could be that he's saying, someone who just didn't do anything with the wicked person. Maybe there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will you kill it and you won't? Will you kill them and you won't kind of forgive the place? Tisa, right, means to carry, because God's going to lift the sin. I've said this before in other contexts, but in the ancient world in particular, a sin has real consequences. Sin doesn't just disappear. You don't just wipe it out, okay? Now, there are exceptions. There are absolutely places where there is talk about wiping a sin out. But in general, there's this idea that sins must be fixed. They must be atoned for, and punishments have to happen. So will God lift the sin and kind of bear the sin instead of bringing punishment, all right? So will you not bear the sin of the place, right? For the 50 righteous people, asher bikir ba, that are within it. Okay. It would be terrible for you to do this thing, to kill a righteous person with a wicked person. And a righteous person would be like a wicked person. In other words, the consequences for both would be the same. That is not fair. All right. It would be a kind of a defilement. What's the word that I want? To a desecration, right? For you. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. He who judges the whole land will not do justice. Okay. Now what's happening here is very interesting. We don't talk about it enough when we read this story. Namely, that Avram is using an idea, and this is one of the things that we always have this argument about, a theological argument, right? Is something moral because it's theologically? Is something moral because God said it's moral? Or is there a morality that is separate from God? Okay. Now, what is the approach that Avraham is taking here? Clearly.
But there's morality.
Yeah, there's a morality separate from God. There's a morality that applies to God. There's something called justice. God judges the world. Shouldn't he do justice? Which exists. We all know what justice is. Now, what's interesting is that God started this kind of opening for dialogue with Abraham because he wanted to teach Abraham what justice is. All right. So it's not hard to make that leap that so many of the Perushim, of the exegetes, do, saying that this is kind of a test for Abraham, right? That he wants to see Abraham kind of jump into this role, right? However, you could also say, look, God is showing him, look, before I punish Sodom, I go investigate, and you should know this is what happens. They all sinned. I'm investigating, and then if I investigate and they're all crummy, in fact, I will destroy them, right? And now Avram's arguing that if you have a certain number, you shouldn't destroy it at all because it's not fair for the innocent to be killed with the guilty, All right. Now, again, I'm translating tzaddikim the whole way as righteous because it's much easier that way, but it also could be innocent with guilty. You could read it that way as well. Vayomer Hashem. So God says, if I find in stone 50 righteous or innocent people within the city, I will lift the, in parentheses, the sin, right? I will bear the sin for the whole place for their sake. Okay. Vayan Avraham Vayomar, and Avram answered and said, Hinena ho'alti l'daber el Adonai v'anochi afar ve'efer. And he says, oh, I'm going to keep talking, and I know that I'm just, dust and ashes, but he's going to keep going. Maybe they'll be missing 5. 50 minus 5. I like the way he's building this logic. He's not saying, well, you do it for 45, but you agreed to 50. I got you on 50. So for 5 people, will you change? Right? So let's make it 45. Okay. I said, no, I won't destroy it if I find it 45. But Yosef, right? Like maybe they're just going to be 40. I will not do this on behalf of the 40. Vayomer alna yichar laDonai batabera ulai yimatzun sham 30. Vayomer lo eseh im emtzeh sham 30. It says, okay, God, please don't be angry. I'm going to keep talking. What if there's 30? He's like, okay, yeah, 30, fine. Okay. Vayomer hinei ho'alti l'daber Adonai ulai yimatzun sham 20. He said, I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to keep going. What about 20? Vayomer lo ashchit bavor hesri. Okay, he says, no, I won't destroy for the 20. But he says, please, God, do not be angry. I will speak even this time. Maybe there will be 10. And God said, I will not destroy it for the 10. Vayelech on behalf of the 10. In other words, I will not destroy the city if there are 10 innocent / righteous people there. And God went when he finished talking to Avram, and Avram returned to his place. Okay, he's done. And then we get to the story of Sodom, right? The two angels go to Sodom and they rescue Lot, right? We get to see how horrible Sodom is up close, right? Just how awful they are to an insane degree. Usually, you think that if someone's miraculously struck by blindness, they will stop trying to get into the door to rape someone's guests. They'd be like, I'm blind. But these people are so wicked that nothing stops them, right? They're horrible. Okay, so we get to see that up close. All right, but let's talk about the dialogue. Okay, so famously, of course, Avram stops at 10. Like, why does he stop at 10? Right. So I think there's an important point here to be made that there's an assumption that, in fact, the way things work is usually innocent people do die with the wicked. In other words, the usual case is that when bad things, and I've mentioned this before, right? It's true biblically also. When something bad happens to a city, no one gets off scot-free. So if wicked people bring a punishment to a city, and I'm sitting there and I'm righteous, I'm like, well, I didn't do anything. It doesn't matter. If the enemy's invading, I'm also invaded, right? So it doesn't help. If there's an earthquake, we all get hurt. So any sort of divine punishment or non-divine, whatever you want to say the punishment is going to hurt the general group, okay? So there's an assumption that that's the way things work. At the same time, see, this is interesting. We see it biblically throughout, that while it works this way, this is not really just. Okay, it works this way, but it's not fair. This isn't okay. And we see this here in this dialogue. In other words, there are innocent people there, they shouldn't die. And yet he stops at 10. If there's fewer than 10, there's no way that God's gonna, there seems to be this assumption. There's no way that God's going to spare the city for fewer than 10 people, right? And then those people are going to die. And from my teacher Mark Smith, he said to me, I once was discussing this with him, and he's like, well, I always thought, he said that Abraham is using his human understanding of what happened. You can't. There are two choices, right? You destroy the city or you don't destroy the city, right? Those are your two choices from Avram's point of view. So either you spare the city because of the innocent people or everyone dies. And God knows that he can get the innocent people out. And that's what he sends the angels to do, right? That he gets Lot and his family out and then he destroys everyone, right? They're fewer than 10, right? But he gets them out and then he destroys everyone. God can do that. But for people usually looking at circumstances, there's this kind of, we all go together. When does this, and I'm sorry, I'm repeating it, when does this biblically, when does this break down? It starts breaking down at the end of the first temple period, when we see Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel, right? So Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu said they both quote the same folk saying, right? Which is Avot achlu boser v'shinei banim tikena. The fathers ate unripe grapes, and the sons' teeth were dulled. Okay, so in other words, we are paying for what our parents did. All right, and that idea. So Yirmiyahu says, in the future, in kind of the Messianic age, you won't be able to say that anymore. It might be true now, but you won't be able to say that anymore in the Messianic age. And Yechezkel says, you can't say that now. It is not true. No one, is punished for their parents' sin, right? In terms of God's punishment. Now, in terms of people punishment, we also have it in Dvarim and Deuteronomy, right? We have, let me actually read the verses to you. So if you look at on Dvarim, Deuteronomy, Chaf Dalet Tet Zayin, that's 24:16. Lo yumtu avot al banim, uvanim lo yumtu al avot ish bechet'o yumatu. So fathers will not be killed for their sons. Sons will not be killed for their fathers. Each person will die for their own sins. So each person. So in human law, right? What that means is in human law, you are not allowed to kill a father for the son or the son for the father. Does God do it? Well, we have the attributes of God, right, that we read about in Shemot and Exodus and in Bamidbar and Numbers, where part of the attributes of God is that he stretches the punishment over 3 to 4 generations. Why does he do that? He does that. That's actually supposed to be merciful, because if God punished everyone right away, everyone would be dead and they wouldn't be able to continue because people sin. And the general understanding is, what's the punishment for sin? Death. So God stretches punishment over several generations so that he doesn't destroy one generation totally. That's that idea. However, that idea is clearly being rejected explicitly. All right. Once we get to when we're at the end of the first temple period, while there are still texts that absolutely use that idea, right? Like, it's not that everyone agrees, okay? But this is a real movement that happens at the end of the first temple period. I'm going to pause here because I see a comment from Moshe. There is an alternative rationale for why Avram stopped at 10, because he knew for a fact that there were 10 innocent people living in Sodom. This also explains why Avram didn't go himself to Sodom to rescue his nephew, because Lot and his family were numbered among the 10 innocent people, and therefore removing Lot would have condemned Sodom to destruction. Avram did not anticipate that God would, but how do you get to 10? He didn't think that God would intervene by himself, thereby bringing the number below 10. Lot and his family, look, his sons-in-law are jerks and won't leave, right? Are they innocent? I guess they're innocent. How many were they? He's got these 2 daughters that aren't married. That's just them, right? You have to have 7 people besides that.
The exact number isn't so important. There may have been others too. The point is that
Avram know. How do you know though? He could say, "I know that Lot and his family are there." Okay.
Avram knows the people in Sodom. He doesn't necessarily only know his nephew.
I don't know, because when we read the story that we get after, it really does sound like it's Lot. Like, it sounds like Lot's the only decent human being in this city, right?
But then he shouldn't have stopped
his
at
family.
10.
He's got a family, right? Yeah, he's got sons-in-law, and one assumes his sons-in-law are fairly decent, right? I mean, they're kind of idiots for not going. Like, why aren't they leaving if they're decent, right? But I don't know. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be. It's not that much of a stretch that it would be him and his daughters and 7 more among his married daughters and sons-in-law and their kids. So he wouldn't have that much.
Or some other people. Or some other people. Look, isn't it a big question? Look, we know what Avram did when Lot was taken captive. He like turned the world upside down to save Lot when he was taken captive, right?
Yeah.
And yet, when he knew that Lot was about to be destroyed potentially, he didn't go to Sodom to tell him get out.
No, it's God, because it's God. Because it's God. I know we're used to this whole idea that everyone gets to talk to God and then do whatever the hell they want, okay? but if you talk to God, right? God's like, I'm gonna destroy the city now. You're not like, well, you know what? I'm just gonna sneak in and get my nephew out against God's will, right? After I negotiated with him and everything, and like, I don't know. I first of all, I really, in this point, I wouldn't expect him to go and get Lot out. He really doesn't know what's gonna happen. My feeling is that at this point, Avram really doesn't know that he didn't save the city, right? He may have saved the city. He doesn't know that.
All right,
right?
I'll just throw out one last thing that supports what I'm saying. When Lot finally leaves with the angel, and he says to him, "Please let me go run away to this place, and don't destroy that place. Let us go."
Oh yeah,
there.
that whole thing is weird. Yeah, go on.
All right, but what I'm saying explains that. And the angel says to him, "Okay, you go there. It won't be destroyed, but go there quickly because I can't do anything until you go there." What does that mean? He says that I can't do anything, and what I'm saying it means is in the terms of the agreement that I made with Abraham, I can't destroy Sodom until you get out.
We've had this discussion before.
Yes, we did.
And I think that's really nasty. That it makes sense to me that he can't do anything until Lot's in a safe place somewhere. That makes sense to me. But to say that God is playing a game where he's promised if there are 10 righteous people, and now he has to get it under 10 so he can kill a bunch of innocent people with stone. I think that there are enough problematic things that are in the text that I don't need to do that. I don't see it. I don't see it. But we've had this discussion before. Anyway, okay. So that's our dialogue. We have this idea that the innocent people, the killing the innocent with the guilty is not right, and yet sometimes that is in fact what happens. Okay, and as I mentioned, while we have in Deuteronomy and Devarim a thing that you're not allowed to do that, we have this idea in the divine attributes that God in fact stretches punishment out over generations, and then we have in the prophets, particularly the late, not the super late ones, but the later ones, Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, that this idea that the children with Yechezkel, he completely rejects collective punishment in general. Yechezkel is Yirmiyahu does not. Yirmiyahu says that in the future there won't be punishment of children for the father's sins, whereas Yechezkel says there is no collective punishment, there is no intergenerational punishment. Everyone is only punished for their sins, essentially at this moment in time. That's when you're judged. If then you become righteous. If you were righteous and now you're wicked, you're going to be judged for being wicked. If you're wicked now you're righteous and you made restitution, you will be judged for being righteous. And children and grandchildren and there's no effect. Every person is, and there's no effect of if you are the one righteous person. And Yechezkel says this, and he gives an example of non-Jews. Right? He says if Eov, Noach, and Daniel, which we read Daniel, because who the heck is Daniel? But now we know that in fact Daniel was a famous ancient Near Eastern kind of judge / righteous person. Okay, so in legend, so he's naming 3 famous righteous non-Jews. He said, if you have Eov, Daniel, and Noah in a place where they're all wicked, and you have these three great righteous people, the place will be destroyed, and only they will remain standing. Only they will remain standing. They will not save the city, and the city will not destroy them. Everyone is judged, but that's once you get to Yechezkel. Yechezkel is the first prophet to speak directly to an exilic community. Yechezkel is the first prophet who was actually speaking to people who are no longer in the land of Israel, where they see that there are different consequences for them in Babylonia than there are for the people in Jerusalem who are still there. And it's the reality of living with numerous exilic communities is that you can feel part of one nation and be very connected to each other, and yet recognize that people aren't punished together necessarily, right? Different communities get different things happen to them, which was something that was not true when everyone's in the same land, to a certain extent. Okay, so that was a little bit of a tangent. Let's read some Hittite stuff. Okay, so why am I looking at the Hittite stuff? You'll see, we see certain parallels in terms of here there is a situation, and I'll tell you the dates so that you can kind of get some context. Okay, so we call it Hittite, but I'm going to correct something I said in a previous class. There actually is a real argument about, are these the Hittim of the Bible or not? Because they're really Chati, they're not Hitti, right? And it's very possible that the Hittim in the Bible are not actually referring to this nation, I guess you could call it, that had a tremendous empire around the time that Ugarit was a city. They had such an empire that they're centered in Turkey, but they were battling Egypt, to give you an idea of the scope, right? So during the time of the Hittite Empire, we call it Hittite because people they wanted to kind of get people to call it the Hatti Empire, and everyone's like, no, it's Hittites like in the Bible, right? So it's not, but there's still this big argument about are the Hittim this nation or not? Okay. We're going to be reading. So I'm gonna read a little bit of an introduction to the prayers, and during that I'm going to kind of say the dates to give you an idea. Okay. So I gave you in your handout. It starts with a book of Hittite prayers. That book, the translation is from 2001. Okay, it's Itamar Singer. Okay, and I gave you. We're starting with Mersili. Who is Mersili? So I'm going to give you the background of all this, of what we're talking about. Okay, and I'm reading actually from Itamar Singer's book. In the reign of Suppiluliuma the First. Okay, Suppiluliuma the First lived 1344 to 1322. So again, this is like towards the end of the Ugaritic texts that we were looking at before. So during that time around. So in the reign of Suppiluliuma the First, a virulent plague broke out in Hatti, which decimated its population for more than 2 decades. Suppiluliuma himself and his eldest son, Arnuwanda II, apparently died of it. And the difficult task of investigating reasons for the calamity and trying to put an end to it were left to the young king Mersili II. Mersili II reigned from 1321 to 1295. Okay. Now let's look at, he sees a whole bunch of prayers that are meant to be read before the gods, and the way the prayers have been traditionally numbered, they've been trying to say, well, this makes sense from a logical point of view, but really we don't know. We just have a bunch of prayers and we don't know the order in which they were written. So the first one I brought you here is a specific hymn and prayer to the sun goddess of Arena. Arena, it's for some reason it's considered separate from the other prayers about the plague. Okay, and I brought it. You'll see in a highlighted section. Whoever it's on, the highlighted section is on page 3 of the handout. Okay, it's on page 53 of the book, paragraph 10. Whoever is the cause of rage and anger to the gods, and whoever is not respectful to the gods, Let the good ones perish with the evil ones. Whether it is a single town, a single house, or a single person, O gods, destroy only that one. Look upon Hatti with pity and give the evil plague to other lands. Now, I've also brought for you a prayer from Mawatali II. He's Mursili's son. So he lived 1295 to 1272. He said something very, very similar. Give me a second and I'll tell you the page for that, because it's after, of course, all of Mursili's prayers. Here we are. Muwatali's prayer is on, it starts page 81, but the part that's, I'm going to page 84, which is page 12 of your handout. So he says something very, very similar. He says, if some single town or some single house does wrong, take vengeance for it, O God, on that single town or on that single house and destroy it. But do not take vengeance for it on the land. Okay. And so there's this argument there of please, only if only one person, and it's a little bit less, it's not so much. It does say, if we go back to page 3 of your handout, we say, whoever is a cause of rage and anger to the gods, and whoever is not respectful to the gods, let not the good ones perish with the evil ones. And that is very similar dialogue that we have, the biblical dialogue, the idea that don't let the good ones perish with the evil ones. But here it's not so much, it doesn't seem to be referring to some kind of general justice. Okay, it's just saying, please, if only one person is responsible, please just destroy him. If only one town is just responsible, please destroy them. Don't destroy the entire land. Okay, now this is just one of many arguments that Mursili uses when he, in his numerous prayers about the plague, specifically about the plague. So here, if you look on page 5 of your handout, which is page 57 in the book, he notes to the gods, he says, but if the gods, my lords, do not remove the plague from Hatti, the makers of offering bread and the libation pourers will keep on dying. And if they too die, the offering bread and the libation will be cut off from the gods, my lords. Then you, O gods, my lords, will proceed to hold the sin against me, saying, why don't you give us offering bread and libation? May the gods, my lords, again have pity on Hatti and send the plague away. I like this. I think this is kind of funny because he's like, gods, you're going to blame me. You're going to blame me when you're not getting your sacrifices. They're all going to die. No one's going to get their sacrifices. You're going to blame me again. So just stop killing all these people who are bringing you sacrifices. Simple solution. Yes.
Plague was. What was the
Sorry.
plague? Do we know what the plague was?
Yeah, so we don't know what the disease was, but let's actually look and see how he himself explains it. So if you go to, here we are. He himself gives an explanation for the plague. And that you'll see on page 6 of your handout, which is page 58 of the book. And he's giving a background. He's talking about how his father went into Egyptian territory and he had this battle with Egyptians. And then in paragraph 5, which is at the bottom of the page, he says, at that time too, the storm god of Hatti, my lord, by his verdict, caused my father to prevail. And he defeated the infantry and the territory of Egypt and beat them. But when the prisoners of war who had been captured were led back to Hatti, a plague broke out among the prisoners of war and they began to die. When the prisoners of war were carried off to Hatti, the prisoners of war brought the plague into Hatti. From that day on, people have been dying in Hatti, right? And what's interesting is, of course, he says this, he gives us quite reasonable explanation of the plague. In other words, there was apparently a plague in Egypt. Apparently, these prisoners of war were carrying the plague. We brought them back to our land, and now everyone's dying from this plague. They caught it from them, okay? That's how he's interpreting it. And yet, he's seeing it as a punishment of the gods. It doesn't stop him from seeing it as a punishment of the gods. He's like, why is there this plague? Tell me what we did, right? He's saying, tell me what we did. What did we do wrong? Was it some sacrifice we stopped bringing? Tell me. And he's trying to do all these oracular things to figure out what the mistake was. Now, by the way, this is something that's called dual causation, all right? So dual causation, people talk about dual causation in the Bible also, where you attribute, say, why did Yoshiyahu die? Well, he died in battle. Why did Yoshiyahu die? Because he went to battle even though God told him not to, right? Like, so you have these two, or not even, it was not even that. Why did Yoshiyahu die? Because his father sinned. Why did Yoshiyahu die? Because he died in battle. You have both of them are true. Both of them are true. And that's not a problem, right? So here we have something outside the Bible that's also using that dual causality, where why do we have the plague? Because we brought in prisoners of war who are apparently carrying the plague. Why do we have the plague? Because we did something wrong. We did something wrong against the gods and we're trying to figure it out. So if we go on to the next page to paragraph 6, that's page 7 of your handout and page 59 in the book. He says, I have just confessed the sin before the storm god Hittite. It is so. We have done it. But the sin did not take place in my time. It took place in the time of my father. That I know for certain. Right? But since the storm god Hittite, my lord, is angry about the matter, and since people are dying in Hittite, I will keep making a plea about it to the storm god Hittite, my lord. He's saying, I'm not responsible. This didn't happen in my time. Right? So don't hold me responsible. Stop killing people. This is from a previous generation. Right? So let's continue to the next page. This is page 8 of your handout and page 60 in the book. Again, the highlighted section. I have confessed the sin of my father. It is so. I have done it. If there is some restitution to be made, then there has already been paid much for this plague, caused by the prisoners of war who were brought back from Egyptian territory and by the civilian captives who were brought back. And since Hittite has made restitution through the plague, it has made restitution for it 20-fold. In other words, whatever we did, and again, remember this idea that I noticed, that I noted, that sins have to be, you need to make retribution for sins. You have to pay for a sin. So whatever the sin was that we did, we paid for it. We paid for it. So stop the plague now, okay? And he uses a whole bunch of different arguments. I mean, it really was apparently a really terrible plague. If we continue on page 10 of the handout, page 63 in the book, he says he's using another argument, which is, this isn't fair. I have not, reading again the highlighted section in paragraph 8, I have not done any evil. Of those who sinned and did the evil, no one of that day is still here. They have already died off. But because the affair of my father has come upon me, I am giving you, O gods, my lords, a propitiatory gift on account of the plague of the land, and I am making restitution. So he's saying, guys, they're all dead. Everyone who sinned is dead, right? By the way, what biblical scenario does that remind us of? Anyone? Anyone? Sorry? Susan, did you say something?
Yes, Dor Hamidbar.
Right, exactly. Dor Hamidbar, the generation that's in the desert, they all have to die off because of the sin of the spies, of not listening, of refusing to go to the land of Israel, right? After the spies lead them wrong, right? Of the Meraglim. And because of that, they've all got to die off in the desert. And it's specifically their children who will continue on to the land, right? They're a generation that sinned, they all die off, and then their kids can go on. Here he's saying, everyone's dead. Everyone who sinned is dead, okay? Can you stop? Stop now, right? So he's using actually arguments. He's using arguments without saying, he's not going so far as saying this isn't fair. He's going so far as saying, look, guys, if it's someone specific, could you just kill that specific person or specific town? If it was something, whatever that generation did, I mean, they're all dead now. Does this generation have to suffer for it? Apparently we do. So I'm bringing all this stuff so that you won't keep punishing us, right? And all the time, of course, recognizing that there's a natural reason for this plague, but he needs an end. He needs an end. So he's simply bringing a whole series of arguments, but without really saying this is unfair, right? Am I in the right? So if we continue on, so that's what he does. He brings a whole bunch of different arguments, all meant to somehow appeal to the gods. You're killing off the people who bring you sacrifices. It wasn't me who did it, it was my father. It wasn't that generation that did it, they're all dead. I will do whatever you tell me to do, just tell me. If it's a specific person to kill him, just kill him. But without actually saying there are laws of justice that I'm calling you to, right? As Abraham dares to do in his dialogue, which really is very daring. I mean, Abraham keeps apologizing, right? And says, please don't be angry. So we're supposed to recognize that what Abraham is doing is meant to be very, very daring. Okay. At the same time, it's recognizing that there's a kind of a justice that he's expecting from God, and that God in the beginning apparently meant to teach him. Okay, so let's continue on just as in contrast. Okay, so I'm gonna again look at this prayer from Muatali, who's the son of Mursili. And now I'm on the 12th page of your handout, and page 84, and that's paragraph 6. We read it before. If some single town or some single house does wrong, take vengeance for it, O God, on that single town or on that single house, and destroy it. But do not take vengeance for it on the land. And then he continues in paragraph 10, even if it is the house, again, I'm reading from the highlighted section, even if it is the house of a poor man, take vengeance for it, O storm God, my Lord, on that house, but do not take vengeance for it on the land. This is interesting because here he seems to recognize there's a morality which says you don't punish poor people. So God, even to a poor person, please overlook that thing. That he's poor, so you should feel bad for him. Don't feel bad for him because he's poor. Just kill him, and don't take it out on the land, right? Just so he's poor, but don't take it out on the land, right? So that's an interesting idea. I'm going to take a short pause before we go on to a contrasting Hittite source. So Danny and Libby Barkai wrote, when Avram is negotiating and God agrees that if there are X number of innocents, he won't destroy the place, does God's agreement in each case mean he already knows that number isn't there? Or is he agreeing that after he checks, he will keep to the deal he made? Well, it depends if you listen to me or Moshe. I think Moshe here would say that he knows everything and it's all kind of it's some fourth-dimensional chess that he's playing. But I think that the idea is he's saying to Avram, because what is he revealing to Avram? What does this thing? Will I not let Avram know what I'm doing? He should know what justice is. He's saying, I'm going to go investigate now. I heard this thing and now I'm going to go investigate. And the assumption is that this is before the investigation, right? The assumption is it's before the investigation. And that's why Avram's having this argument. Because otherwise, one would assume he'd be like, okay, God, well, how many righteous people are there in this, you investigated? Are they really all wicked? And then you would say, well, God's like, oh, like there are 15 people, they're okay. And then he can have a dialogue, right? But I think the way the narrative reads is that God is revealing this to him before checking, saying, now I'm going to go check. And I'm revealing this to you so you should know the way of justice. Before I do anything, I'm going to go check and investigate. And then Avram is like, well, are you really going to destroy everyone when there are innocent people in the city? Now, moving on. So Eliza asks, where and in what form were the Hittite prayers found? Sorry if you said this and I missed it. I did not say the truth is I don't remember exactly the specific place. The Hittite Empire was centered in, it was from Turkey, and it spread out when it was the height of the empire. Again, it was reaching down towards Egypt. It was that prominent. It was tremendous. So this is right now we're reading things from the height of the empire. Hittite is the language is Indo-European. In case you care, some people consider it the first Indo-European language that we have evidence of, the earliest Indo-European language. Some people think that it shares a common source with Proto-Indo-European, but you can't exactly call it Indo-European because that matters tremendously to me. I know. Sorry, since it's Indo-European, I'm like, okay, fine. It uses Akkadian cuneiform though. So it's written in Akkadian cuneiform, but it itself is a completely different language family. Because if you remember Akkadian cuneiform, you can read as the sound of the word, right? It could be the meaning of the word or the sound of the word. So it's not too hard for other languages actually to use that cuneiform. Okay, so now I want to share with you a contrasting piece, and that's also in your handout. If we continue on, this is from the Context of Scripture, which is an SBL. SBL is a Brill publication. So not an SPL publication, a real publication. And I'm now on page 14 of your handout and page 217 of that book. And I'm reading instructions to priests and temple officials. And I will read you in the introduction, which you have, right? The tablets are to be found in both the Istanbul and Ankara tablet collections. The copies date to the Empire period, but the text itself seems to go back to the pre-New Hittite period, before the reign of Shuppiluliuma the First. Shuppiluliuma the First is the guy that we started with, the guy who kind of brought the plague, or the guy under who we don't know if actually he brought the plague. We know that Marsili thinks that that's how the plague entered. But at any rate, Shuppiluliuma is the one who during whose reign the plague started. Okay, so they think that these instructions actually predate him, even though the copies are during his period, and one assumes later. So these are instructions to priests. Okay, and if you look at my highlighted section, are the mind of man and God somehow different? No. In this which is concerned, no. The mind is one and the same. When the servant stands before his master, he is washed. He has clothed himself in clean clothes. He gives him, his master, either to eat or to drink. Since the master eats and drinks, in his spirit he is relaxed. And there's what is this? What's the comparison? What's the analogy? A servant gives his master food and drink, and a priest gives his master, the god, sacrifices, right? And he puts him on the appropriate dress, and he serves the god, and then the god is happy, right? He is favorably inclined. So because when he eats in his spirit, he is relaxed. He is favorably inclined toward him, the servant. When he is solicitous, his master does not find fault with him. Is the mind of the god somehow different? If the servant at some point angers his master, either they kill him, or they injure his nose, eyes, and ears, or he, the master, will seize him and his wife, his children, his brother, his sister, his in-laws, and his family, whether his master's male or female slave. They may only call him over. They may do nothing to him. If ever he dies, he does not die alone. His family is also included with him. In other words, if you are a servant and you anger your master, you think it's only you who's going to die? No, your whole family's going to get it. It doesn't work that way. What do you think people do? People don't just punish one person. They punish his whole family. That's what your master's going to do. If you die, you do not die alone. So why would a god be different? If, however, someone angers the mind of a god, does the god seek revenge only from him alone? Does he not seek it from his wife, his children, his descendants, his family, his male and female servants, his cattle, his sheep, and his grain? He utterly destroys him with everything. Be very afraid of a God's word for your own sake. In other words, what is the idea here? The idea here for both people and gods, and recognize this isn't just regular people. This is a master-slave relationship, okay? But the idea is, a master, he punishes you. Doesn't he punish everyone? We're not used to this idea because we don't have that idea biblically, and we haven't really seen it so much elsewhere. We did see it. I'll remind you, when we were looking at the Neo-Assyrian, at the Middle Assyrian rape laws, if you recall, where the wife gets raped because her husband's a rapist, right? That is that sort of idea, right? That his property can be punished for something he did because it's his property, and that's their main function. But here it's very clear that it's talking about not as property, but as your family, right? If you anger your master, the revenge comes to everyone and everyone connected to you. And if you anger your God, he's going to take it out on everyone. Why should a God think differently from a person, right? A person's mind and a God's mind are the same. Okay, so this is an interesting idea and take on it. Notice it's supposed to be earlier than the text. The source is supposed to be earlier than the text we read, but also it's a whole different idea. It's saying, and recognize the different genre here. What we read earlier was a king who's trying to get a plague removed from his land. He honestly doesn't care if a household is killed or a city is killed. He says it specifically. If it's one city that sinned, just destroy the city and save the rest of us, right? He's thinking in terms of the whole land, right? Here, you're talking about to an individual. He's a priest. You're giving him instructions and trying to scare him into doing the right thing, quote unquote, into serving the gods correctly. And they're like, buddy, you're a slave now. What happens to a slave when he gets his master angry? Think what the God's going to do. Okay. But the idea is, this is a God. You don't expect extra justice from a God. You expect him to act like any master would with a slave. And if you anger your master, you don't die alone. The same thing goes with a God. So dress up nice, give him the sacrifices right, don't screw up. Okay. It's a whole different idea about the gods, right? Now, I want to go back, okay, to our dialogue here. All right. How are we for time? Oh, we're fine. I want to go back to our dialogue here, because what is the story here? Is Abraham, what is the connection here in Abraham's dialogue with God? What's the connection between divine morality and human morality? What is that connection? And it's not 100% clear. Like, I shouldn't say that. There's something, one part of it is quite clear, which is that humans are supposed to learn justice from what God does, right? That's at least what's set out in the beginning. God's like, will I hide from Avram, my servant? His nation, the nation that comes from him, is going to cause blessing to the whole, to the whole world. And so he must learn the way of the Lord, which is the way of justice, right? So he's got to learn how justice is done. And then Avram flips it on him and he says, will the judge of the world not do justice? Okay, so on the one hand, there's a connection, there's a deep connection between divine morality and human morality, and at the same time, an expectation of divine morality. In other words, there's a morality that both God and Avram are aware of. There's something called justice, and both of them are aware of it, right? God doesn't say, I decide what justice is. When Avram says, well, there's something called justice. Both of them are aware of it. God wants to teach Abraham justice. Abraham wants God to act with justice, right? And so he uses arguments to prove that the just thing to do would be to let the whole city go free in order to avoid killing 10 innocent people, right? Because those are the choices. Whereas if you have fewer than 10 innocent people, look, God wants to destroy the city, right? So there's, on the one hand, you have an abstract morality, a connection between divine morality and human morality, and at the same time, an expectation of kind of extreme morality from God. Okay, if we compare this with the Hittite prayers, which absolutely, you've got someone who's trying to end a plague. Yeah, I feel I can really identify with this king. He's trying to get this plague done, and he's doing whatever he can. He's using any argument he can think of, right? But what he doesn't, and he is using arguments. He isn't saying, there's this kind of abstract justice thing that you're not supposed to kill the next generation, or, which would be unusual actually for him to say, or there's this divine justice thing that the innocent is not supposed to. He does, however, say, don't let the innocent die with the wicked. He says, don't let the innocent die with the wicked, please, right? Just kill, it was one town, just kill that one town, come on, right? But it's along with a whole string of arguments, any one of which he hopes is going to work with the gods, right? And at the same time, in a different genre, and there really are differences just when you switch to genres. So you shouldn't be surprised to see a kind of a different approach, even if we could say, oh, well, that's more primitive because it's earlier. It's also a different genre with a different purpose, right? So if we're looking at the priest rules, where the purpose is to get the priest scared so that he's going to do the work correctly, there it's like, you can't expect more from a God than you expect from a person. On the contrary, I mean, they're more dangerous because it's easier for them to just completely destroy you than it is for a regular person to completely destroy you. But that's what you can expect. You can expect it from a master, a human master, and you can expect it from a God. You didn't feed them right. They're not in a good mood. You're gonna pay. Okay. And just a very, very, absolutely no expectation of a higher level of morality from the gods. On the contrary, very much a kind of frankly what we would expect, when we kind of go into that world where feed them and they'll be happy with you, right? Get them, catch them how do you catch them in a good mood? You feed them first. So I'm going to take a pause now. Before we conclude, we have a nice short class tonight. I'm going to read some of these comments that are coming in. Okay. Is it thought to be a precursor to the Greek? You mean Hittite? I don't, again, I think that's why there's this argument. I don't know enough in terms of where Greek comes in. Greek is so much later. The Greek that we have is so much later than these texts, right? And again, that's one of the things that this Hittite is so early. That's why there's an argument that it's actually not, it's not in the line between what they call Proto-Indo-European and the later Indo-European languages, but rather it's kind of next to that Proto-Indo-European, or like a little bit before the Proto, so it's even a question whether it's in that line, but let's call it Indo-European. I don't have a particular say in it, but Greek is much later. So I don't know enough about where Greek fits in to that string. The Torah objects to favoring the poor when it comes to meting out justice. Rich or poor should be treated the same by a judge. Right, Susan, exactly. And why would we need this rule? You need the rule because there's an automatic assumption that you want to kind of favor the poor person. You're like, they're poor. Are we really going to find in favor of this other guy? This guy's really poor. It's not right. It's kind of wrong. And so the reason you have to have that rule is because people have that instinctive desire to favor the poor person out of mercy, right? Out of pity, rather. And I think that once again, the fact that in Mercilli's, I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name wrong, by the way, but in Mercilli's argument with the gods, and says, look, if they're poor, no, I don't think it was Mercilli, I think it was Mawatali. He says, if they're poor, still don't have mercy on them at the expense of everyone else. Punish them and let everyone else off. And that's an assumption that the gods are going to do the same sort of thing. Gods also have this kind of, but he's poor, right? Whereas biblically, there is this commandment. And again, whenever you have a commandment, that usually means that people want to do the opposite, right? That someone wants to do the opposite, right? Let's see. Are the mind of man and God somehow different? No, in this which is concerned, no, the mind is one and the same. Right. Moshe was quoting from the instruction to the priests. They are repeating that the mind of pure people and the minds of gods are exactly the same. I see. I missed your continuation. This is incredibly reminiscent of Isaiah, Yeshayahu 45, 8-9. Ki lo machshavotay machshavotechem v'lo darkechem drachai, no Hashem, because your thoughts are not my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways, says God. Ki gavhu shamayim me'aretz ken gavhu drachai me'darkechem u'machshavotay machshavotechem. Because as the heaven is higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Right. So that's Yeshayahu, Isaiah 45, 8-9. Thank you, Moshe. Right. So that there, in that case, it's very clear that you're supposed to think of God as being way above you. Right. You can't hold God to the same. You can't expect the same sort of thing. And also the idea that God knows more than you can possibly know. You say Isaiah seems to be almost directly refuting the statement in the instructions to priests and temple officials. I would say that, I doubt that he's actually refuting this specifically, but I imagine that this was a general approach. If they're writing it out this clearly in a text like this, I assume that there were other, not just instructions to priests, but a general approach saying, this is what we'd expect from people. This is what we would expect from God. And also that whole idea of God as a slot machine, right? Where we bring a sacrifice and now he'll do stuff for us. We worship him and now he'll do stuff for us. That kind of thing is also based on this idea of, having a patron, and we do this for him, we give him compliments and he'll do stuff for us. People wanted to, it was a natural thing, throughout the ancient Near East. Also, of course, in later mythology, you have gods acting like people, right? Like usually really irresponsible people, right? Because they're also gods. But you have these gods acting like people and falling, having affairs and doing all these different things and having favorites among human beings, right? Like we had in the flood story, where the reason that the Noah character gets off in the parallel flood stories, the reason he survives is because he has a special relationship with this God who sneaks him information, right? And who wants to get him free. And so it's not because of any special morality. It's not because he's particularly good. It's because he has this relationship with this God. He has a patron God, and the God helps him out. So that idea that's I think it's pretty common. I think it's less, we're not used to seeing it spelled out this way. Gods think just like people. Like, don't think they don't, right? But it's true that the passage in Yeshayahu, the passage in Isaiah really does read like a response to that. Any other questions or comments before I conclude? Anything? Okay. So I think what we see here on the one hand is that this idea. Oh, sorry.
I sent you a question.
Oh, okay. Here, I see the question. I thought in ancient times, the poor actually had fewer rights, not pity from the powers that be. I would imagine that there was a mix. So on the one hand, you have, I don't think that no one had this idea that you want to be just to people who lack justice, right? I don't think that this is, it wasn't, if you want a relatively flourishing country, you don't want a lot of people who feel that they're being, screwed over all the time, right? It's true that there are different rules. And as I mentioned, the Code of Hammurabi has different rules depending on what level of person you are. Like the law is different, right? At the same time, there is this idea that you're supposed to be able to get justice, right? There is this idea that whatever level you are, there is a law that applies to you. And then the problem becomes, particularly when we see this in terms of the biblical injunction, what happens when you really have no recourse to the law whatsoever? You are a widow or an orphan, or you come from somewhere else, you don't have family, no one's backing you up. Who's going to take care of you, right? And that's when you have like biblical commandments, you've got to take care of these people. You must take care of these people. You must make sure they have justice because no one's looking out for them. That's less being poor and more being completely unconnected to other people because people have a family unit and people to back them up, right? I know you just gave me an opening to bring in Eskimo law. There was a story, an anthropologist went to Eskimos and he was trying to figure out what their laws are because it's completely oral. It was at the time a completely oral society. And he heard a story of a situation where there was a family that had joined a village and a killing happened. Someone killed a member of that family. And the village decided, in order to prevent, they said, now there's going to be a string of honor killings back and forth if we don't nip this in the bud. So their solution was to exterminate the family. So one kid, I think, escaped. But their solution was, this is a family, it's just that family here. They don't have anyone else they're connected to. If we let this go, there's going to be honor killings between this family and everyone else back and forth for decades. That's the way it would work. You could wait 10 years for revenge, but then you get it, right? And they're like, we don't want that. So instead, we're just going to wipe out the family and problem solved. So that's kind of an extreme example of, I'm not saying that all Eskimos were like this, but this was apparently a case that happened. And so that's an extreme example of a society where here's a family, they're not connected to anyone, and now there's no one to protect them. Okay, and you can imagine that in other very family-based societies, how vulnerable that could make you if you were a widow or an orphan or someone who came from outside and you got into a legal argument with someone. Who's going to have your back? So at those times, especially, that's when you need an injunction to take care of these people. I think that in general, I'm sure that it depended on the period, and I'm sure that it depended on the place, but I don't think that everyone was so totally immoral at all times that they really said it's fine to smush poor people. I think basic pity. I think pity and empathy are part of not just the human condition, but if anyone knows the rat experiment, where they had a rat, it's one rat stuck in a cage, and this other rat tries to get it out, right? And not only does it try to get it out, but it saves candy for it for when it gets out, right? There's animals. There's this basic empathy. There's this basic empathy that's built in to some animals, at least some animals, and also human beings. And I think that, I mean, it gives me hope, right? And I don't think it's just in the modern age. And on that note, so I just want to kind of conclude. So what we saw was, on the one hand, similar recognition of when we looked at the biblical dialogue and the Hittite prayers, a similar recognition of the innocent shouldn't die with the wicked, right? Don't let the innocent die with the wicked. But we saw a difference in terms of, is there a principle of justice I can appeal to? And in particular, appeal to the divine, right? And say, here is justice. Will you not do justice, right? Which is very basic to that dialogue between Avram and God. It's presented to it, even though Avram's really pushing it. And we're supposed to see that he's really pushing it because he keeps on saying, don't be angry. I'm going to keep on going. Don't be angry, right? He's really pushing it. But the idea is that he can appeal to this higher, this idea that God, at least according to what he said before, wants him to appeal to this, right? And that's a basic part of the way God runs the world, is this idea of justice, as problematic as this collective punishment thing is, right? And as in fact, innocent people can end up dying, right? Whereas in the Hittite prayers, here's a king who's desperately trying to get a plague to stop, and he's using every argument he's got, but he doesn't seem to have the ability. It could be that would be considered disrespectful, but he's not saying it isn't just to do X, or it is not according to, the gods to do such and such. He doesn't say that. And when we read the instructions to the priests, we can understand why not, because gods are not necessarily supposed to be held to a higher moral standard than a particularly pernicious master with a slave, right? We don't hold gods to any higher standard than what we would hold a pretty crappy master. And that's how gods behave. So on the one hand, we see similarities in terms of the concerns and the desire to save the innocent, and at the same time, a different idea of what is the divine will, and what is justice. Anyway, I was excited to teach this to you guys, or to discuss this with you guys. I hope you liked it. Yes. Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah. The general gist I get from the Hittite prayer is that that he's beating around the bush. What he wants to say to the God, hey, you're screwing up, but he feels he can't say that, so he's saying look, you're not acting in your own self-interest. He's coming up with every argument possible without actually coming out and saying.
I don't think he's saying he's screwing up, because I think he thinks it's a punishment. He seems to be treating it as a deliberate act by the gods. In other words, he doesn't seem to say, hey, gods, you let this get out of control, rein it in. He's saying, you're punishing us. Just tell us what it is. We'll do whatever you want. If it's something that my father did, he's dead. If it's something that the previous generation did, they're dead. Please, please, just tell me, what was it? And he's doing all these oracles. I didn't I didn't read through all the letters, all the prayers with you, but he goes into like, I did this oracle, I did that oracle, to try and figure out what we did wrong. He sees it as a punishment of the gods, and he's trying to figure out which gods. Like he keeps on expanding the gods that he's praying to try and figure out what was it, what do we do, what do we need to do to fix it, right? He doesn't seem to think that the gods have screwed up. He thinks the gods are punishing them for something that they're still trying to figure out what it is. And he'll just do anything to stop it. So he'll use arguments like, you're killing off the people who are bringing you sacrifices. He'll use arguments like, whatever they did, they're dead. And he'll use a lot of, and I didn't bring this too much because it wasn't that connected, but he keeps on pleading with them. Please tell me what you want. Tell me what I need to do to fix it. I will do I already gave you this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this other thing. Is that enough? Isn't that enough? You know, like, it's sad. It's sad. I mean, I think we can all understand this feeling of total helplessness in front of a plague. What do I have to do to make it stop? What do I need to do? But he doesn't seem to think that they don't have the power to stop it. He thinks it's a punishment. That's what he seems to think. You know, he can, again, you have the dual causality. He's like, the plague started because we brought in these prisoners from Egypt, and then the plague spread from there. At the same time, it's also a punishment from the gods. It's very clearly a punishment from the gods, and he's trying to figure out what he needs to do to stop it. Which is another point where there isn't quite the same, what we're used to, I think, is an assumption of divine benevolence, which is, I don't think it's completely absent here. Like he thinks they screwed up. He doesn't think that they're just being arbitrary, but there isn't the same assumption. Of like, but don't you want us to prosper? Don't you want us to live? On the contrary, why do they want him to live? The argument he makes is, you're killing off the people who bring these sacrifices, right? So there is not an assumption of divine benevolence, and so he really does think it's a punishment. Again, I didn't read because there's a lot of prayer there, right? But he's really trying. You really feel for him. He's just trying to figure out, what did we do? Just tell us what we did, you know. Again, so if we can't figure out what we did, if we can't figure out how to make it right, let's use these logical arguments like, well, those people are dead, you know. And he says, right? He says, my father's dead, and I'm still bringing stuff to you, even though I'm not the one who did it. My father did it, and he's gone. Even so, I'm bringing you stuff. So please stop. Please stop it. Anyway, and on that happy note, thank you for joining me. May our own little plague end soon. And I'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.